Let's get started. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be focusing more on a topic helping those who really want to try and elevate their studying in the Bible because they just don't really know where to start. So today's video is going to be focused on 5 tips to help with studying the Bible. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Just after one disclaimer, just a reminder, I'm not a pastor, and none of my videos should be used as a reason to not go to church. These are just more or less videos that are designed to reach out to those who are young in the faith, new to the faith, or interested in the faith, and helping them and edifying them. So this is not meant to be any form of church or anything like that. But we'll go ahead and get started with the first tip for today, which is understanding the audience of the book. So every different, like New Testament especially, book has different audiences. Some of them have the same audience as another, or some of them might have an audience going through similar issues, but they all have an audience that they're speaking to. And oftentimes, whenever we're looking at those audiences, we get a more detail into exactly what that book of the Bible is talking about. So when we look at, say, the Gospel of Matthew, it's a gospel that's primarily got a lot of context for those who are familiar with Judaism and are Jews or are just really knowledgeable on the subject. And so that's a way of portraying the gospel to them, while Luke was more focused more towards Gentiles. Or you look at like Romans. The book of Romans was written to the church in Rome, and it was written for both Jews and Gentiles. Has this whole kind of point on different theological stances, different understandings of the gospel and sin and how we're dead to sin and how we're free from the law and all these other things, where it's just this massive kind of theological standpoint book that was written to the church in Rome, which was one of the more prominent churches at the time. You can also look at like Timothy was helping establish, helping fix a lot of issues going within the church, and a lot of what was talking about in Timothy has to do with establishing church authority or handling issues of false teaching and stuff like that. I know that's not everything that was in those books or in those letters, but still, that's just an example. Another thing that falls within researching the audience of the book is knowing what issues they were struggling with during that time. So, like when you look at, I believe it's just First Corinthians primarily is what I'm going to be using as example here. They were struggling with a lot of different pagan practices that were being instituted into the church. There was a lack of accountability. There were a lot of different issues going on that I just haven't touched on. But there were so many issues that had to be addressed that that's what Paul's letter was addressing. Or you look at Second Peter, and so much of Second Peter has to do with false teaching. And so whenever you're researching and you're trying to study the book, you have to remember that a lot of this is under the context of false teaching. And usually, a translation like the ESV has these headers that kind of give you direction as well, to where if it does kind of change subject a little bit, it'll note this is a little more closer to what the subject was. But anyways, on to that second tip. And that second tip is before you start going down the verses, read the entirety of the chapter first. So what I'm saying by this is it helps give you a broad, full picture. So one example I like to use is Romans 9, because when I study Romans 9, you get this, that's the massive chapter on election. And when I study it, you read talking about Israel, talking about election, talking about the nation of Israel. And you see this whole chapter, the context and this sandwich of talking about the nation of Israel and the national like Christian belief and the national Christian like overall group of Christians, the Catholic Christians. You see this context of okay, well, from what I'm reading, Romans 9 very clearly talks about a national election rather than an individual election. And then that helps guide studying in that section. I know I probably annoyed anyone that's reformed reading this, but it's okay. We love you anyways because you're probably still going to heaven anyways. But yeah, reading that full chapter helps you get a full picture of the of obviously of the chapter, but it helps you kind of see everything where it started, where it ended, and it helps you understand more of what's in between. But that's everything for that second tip. The third one is to break the chapter down by sections. So this is kind of going through one, two, three, four verses. These all connect to each other. So this is going to be the passage right here. There are some translations that really help with that. The ESV does this and breaks sections into actual individual sections for you. The Net Bible does this, but translations like the King James doesn't do that. So you're going to see just a straight wall of text that you're going to have to break down yourself. That's one reason why, when it comes to studying, I prefer book like translations like the ESV or the Net because they're a lot easier to just kind of follow. You don't have to try and break this down yourself. But it helps. This whole tip helps with organizing and making studying a lot more specific. So you're kind of specifying what exactly you're trying to study. And so then that gets into the fourth point is after you've broken down into those sections, you start breaking that section down verse by verse. So you go into each one and you see this verse. So what is this verse saying? You go into verse 2. What is this verse saying? And sometimes they'll go more of like these 2 to 3 verses have one singular application, but then sometimes whenever you break down this passage, this verse has its own application point. This one has an application point you can pull from it, and you can pull one from each one within that passage. And so there's a lot of different kind of like varieties of ways you can kind of go about it, I would almost say. Um, yeah, and so there's like a lot of different verses can give you a lot more whenever you're trying to break it down verse by verse or 2 verses or 3 verses, and so it can a lot help you understand what the Bible is saying a lot better. And then the last point, which is one of the most important points whenever you are trying to study the Bible, is to keep everything in context. Know what the author was writing about, know the situation going on around that time, know everything that's going into it. Because there can be times where 2 verses could say something that looks similar, but could mean two wildly different things depending on the context. Because that context and what's going on could mean that it's this is addressing this issue, while this is addressing this issue. So this verse only applies to this, while this verse only applies to this situation. And there's also verses that can appear to contradict when looked at on a surface level, but knowing the proper context can help rectify it. Because you look at like there's this whole common argument of Paul saying faith alone is what saves you, and then James saying that faith should produce works, and there's this whole misconception of well they're against each other, but when you actually look at the context of what both of these authors were saying, Paul is saying faith alone is what saves you. James is saying faith alone is what saves you. And you see that faith through works. Like that person will do works, and that is evidence that they are saved. It's not a works is required to be saved, it's that saving faith produces works. But that's everything that I have for the video today. So I hope this video blessed you, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.